Hello, welcome back to the Translation, Interpreting and Culture Conference live from the State Scientific Library in Banska Bystrica. My name is Mariana Bachlodova, and this session will be dedicated to the human factor in machine translation and post-editing. We will hear 6 speakers. There has been a little change. It means that Mr. Černovatý will give his presentation as the first one. Then we will hear Magdalena Bila and Ingrida Vaňková, Markéta Števková and Ivo Poláček, and finally Marian Kabat. And now I would like to invite our first speaker, Mr. Černovatý. Mr. Černovatý, please now turn on your microphone and start sharing your presentation here on Zoom, okay?
As far as I understand, the presentation would be shown from Banska Bystrica.
Mr. Černovatý, please start sharing your screen now on Zoom, okay? You will just simply share it here on Zoom, and you can start speaking.
Okay. Just a moment. Well, I can't switch on my video because the program says it cannot do it. So you will just be listening to me.
Okay, so we will be just listening.
Okay.
Okay, you can start speaking, Mr. Černovatý. See, you are sharing. Something is coming. Perfect. Okay, we can see your presentation. Now you can start speaking. The floor is yours.
Okay. All right. Because of the time limit, I'll have to shorten my presentation a little because everybody wants to speak. Now, I can't turn the page. I can't turn the page. Probably I need a page.
Okay, Mr. Černovatý, it does not matter. We will click your presentation, okay? We will play it. Just start speaking, and when you want the next slide, tell us, and we will do it for you, okay?
Okay, now let's begin then from slide 6. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm sorry for this scenes, but it's the technical problem. So at the time I presented my abstract for this conference, this problem seemed to be largely theoretical one. Thus, I was planning to indulge into some philosophical reflection on what might happen to the translator-machine interaction in the nearest future and beyond, when the issue suddenly turned into a very practical one. With the advent of the COVID restrictions, the teaching process went completely online, and that was when real problems started. Next slide, please. In general, the development of the translator's professional competence is the result of the students' intensive thinking and analytical activity in the process of solving various translation problems and making appropriate decisions. Because the same types of problems eventually re-emerge in various parts of the text, as well as in various texts, a corresponding neural network is gradually developed in the students' minds, and this network forms the basis of their translation proficiency in general. For evident reasons, the bulk of the said activity falls on the students' independent work. Next slide, please. However, in online teaching, in the course of independent work, which is mostly related to written translation, students can instantly translate any text by just touching a button. Even if they look across the target text after that, this review is usually very formal and brief. Thus, the intensity of their thinking and analytical activity is typically quite low, so we can hardly expect either the development of the said neural network or the written translation skills formation in general. The appeals to the student's sense of duty are generally ineffective because, according to the available research, for example, Young of 2021, they perceive the amount of time and work that is saved when using machine translation to be a greater benefit than the fuzzy prospect of their professional future. The hope that the students compensate their inadequate activity by intense post-editing falls short of expectations either. Most of them, at best, limit themselves to symbolic substitutions of several words in a paragraph with their synonyms. The direct ban on the use of MT in the students' independent work is not applicable either, as they easily overcome it by varying their MT systems and using other means to disguise the MT application. Thus, the teachers often found themselves frustrated and helpless under the avalanche of their students' mostly poorly edited, machine-translated homework. Next slide, please. With this problem in mind and the need to teach an online course, I decided to research the ways of stimulating the intensity of my students' activity in their independent work. Thus, the aim of my research was to develop a translator training system that could promote the students' analytical and thinking activity in the process of doing their home tasks. To fulfill this aim, several objectives had to be accomplished. To outline the principles of the translator training system, to select the subjects and the domain of the research, to organize and conduct the experimental teaching, to design the test, to represent, process, and interpret the experimental data, to formulate the preliminary conclusions, and to outline the prospect of further research. Next slide, please. Because the ban on the use of MT, as I have already said, in the students' independent work is ineffective, our approach was based on the idea of turning MT into an important catalyst to promote the students' analytical and thinking activity. That is, in doing their home tasks, the students had to translate the source text from English into Ukrainian by means of the Google Translate system first, and then to post-edit the resulting target text thoroughly. To provide for this thoroughness and avoid the students' formalistic approach to this process, we use the Think Aloud protocol experimental procedure modified for the needs of written translation. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see the structure of the home tasks of the students. So the first column contains the source text, the second, the machine translation of this text, and the third, the post-edited machine translation text, and the fourth, which is for conveniences, placed below these three columns, contain the expected students' explanation. For example, in this case, the students could provide such explanation as both at the clause and word levels we see literal translation. Thus, the machine translated target text looks unnatural and requires some changes. So the sentences was modified by means of contextual substitution. Here you see the examples and word additions, etc., etc. Next slide, please. Based on the said principles, we formulated the research hypothesis. The regular weekly home task students post-editing of target text translated by means of the MT Google Translate system in combination with the TAP procedure modified for written translation promotes the intensification of students' analytical and thinking activity and correspondingly the development of their critical approach to terminological problems, as well as the efficiency of specialized terminology acquisition and its use in the process of independent, that is, without machine translation. Next slide, please. To test this hypothesis, we conducted a pilot experimental study with a semester-long elective course which is called Specifics of Translated English Language Discourse in Psychology. Its duration constituted 120 academic hours, 28 contact hours, and 92 hours of independent work. The course consisted of 3 modules. This presentation analysis is limited to the result within the first module only, 8 contact hours and 30 hours of independent work. The module covered 3 subject areas: history of psychology, methods of research, and cognitive psychology, and provided for the work with the subject-related original English language text. Next slide, please. The subjects included 23 first-year, second semester MA students majoring in Germanic languages and literature. Translation included 20 females and 3 males. Of the School of Foreign Languages at Karazin National University, Kharkiv, Ukraine, 21 to 24 years of age. By the beginning of the experiment, the expected level of their command of English ranged from C1 to C2 within the Common European Framework of Reference classification. Their experience in specialized translation, that is social, economic, legal, as well as in domains of technology and natural sciences, amounted to over 200 contact hours. The subjects were properly motivated as the results of their homework were taken into account when assessing their progress within the said course. Next slide, please. Procedure. At a weekly online classes, 80 minutes each, with a teacher, a new topic material was introduced and explained, and the students did some side translation exercises accompanied by the analysis. The students' independent work included some preparatory exercises as well as the text, which the students translated by means of machine translation and then post-edited them in the above-mentioned manner. The edited target text, together with their explanation of the reasons for their corrections, had to be uploaded into a corresponding Google Classroom, where the students could also find the course syllable, recommendations on the home task, the assessment system, explanation and online classes and home task materials, etc. Next slide, please. The students' weekly home tasks were analyzed according to the degree of their creativity, that is, non-formalistic approach, which was considered to be an indicator of their post-editing intensity. Following the analysis, each student's work was referred to one of the 4 levels. Level A, completely independent post-editing, many corrections, with motivated explanations. Level B, mostly independent, a moderate amount of corrections, occasionally lacking motivated explanation. Level C, largely formal, an insignificant amount of corrections, commonly deficient in motivated explanation. And level D, completely formal, few corrections without motivated explanations, omissions, or obvious errors in the MT target text. Next slide, please. To convert the level into a numerical form, we developed a spatial 10-point scale where each of the 4 levels was assigned a numeric indicator, as you see in the table. For example, if the raters decide that the specific work should be classified as belonging to level A, they give it the mark of 10. If they hesitate between levels A and B and finally decide in favor of A, the mark is 9. But if they choose B, the mark is 8. However, if the raters do not have any doubt that it is level B, the mark is 7. So the same procedure is applied if the student's work belongs to one of the lower levels, C or D, or their combinations. Following the analysis of the student's work, they were arbitrarily subdivided into 3 groups. Group A, 9 to 10 points, B, 6 to 8 points, and C, below 6 points. Next slide, please. Could you show that? Oh, thank you. Elicitation procedure included a translation test at the end of Module 1. The subjects were expected to translate the 248-word original text in 45 minutes without any machine translation. Formally, the students were not allowed to use the machine translation during the test, but there were no technical means to exclude this possibility. So the students' target texts were assessed by comparing them with the machine translation target text on the basis of the said 10-point scale to verify the degree of their independence. The text comprised 31 terms whose acquisition and use were controlled in the analysis. The machine made 23 errors in translating the 31 terms controlled in the test, that is, its terminological accuracy amounted to 26%, which is a very low mark, as you understand. If our hypothesis is valid, we can expect the highest degree of literary coincidence with the machine translation among the subject with the lowest thinking and analytical activity in their homework, that is Group C, while the share of such coincidences in Group A should be the least significant, with the Group B subjects result somewhere in between. On the other hand, the efficiency of the spatialized terminology acquisition and the accuracy of its use in the independent translation during the test should be directly proportional to the said intensity. That is, it should be the highest in Group A and the lowest in Group C. Next slide, please. This table shows the results of our teaching. Columns 2 and 3, the abbreviation I explained below, HWI, is the degree of homework independence out of 10 points. The second one, TI, the degree of test independence, also out of 10. The MTA means machine translation acceptable variance, and MTU, machine translation unacceptable variance. So columns 2 and 3 show that Group A subject has the highest index both in the homework 9.6 and the test 7.5 independence, followed by Group B 7 and 4.8 respectively, and C 1.7 and 1.6. Based on these figures, it seems logical to assume the high intensity of thinking and analytical activity in Group A, a moderately high one in Group B, and very low in Group C. The subject's independence indices correlate with their general terminological accuracy in the test translation, see column 4. In Groups A, 70% and B, almost 51%, but do not in Group C, 46%. As one could expect, a more substantial disparity between groups B and C, at least. It may be assumed that because the group C subjects predominantly rely on the MT variants, which were acceptable in every fourth case, it artificially improved the group's accuracy index. It becomes evident if you compare the terminological accuracy rate in the cases where the MT options were acceptable, colon 5, versus those when they were not, colon 6. In the former case, acceptable MT options, the group C accuracy index, almost 86%, is almost equal to the similar index in group A, almost 88%, while in the latter, it is almost 3 times less, almost 23% versus 63%. The said assumption is also supported by the rate of coincidence with the MT options. The average rate, colon C, amounted to 21% in group A and almost 34% in group B and almost 53% in group C. In relation to the acceptable MT options, colon 8, the group C subjects copied them in 83% of cases out of almost 86%, while the subject of the other two groups often used alternative acceptable variants. Group A used it in almost 32% of cases out of 88, and group B in 36% of the cases out of 77%. The indicator of the ability to solve terminological problems in the subject's performance when the MT suggested unacceptable options is shown in column 6. Here, they are, this is in red color. Here, their terminological accuracy variance in different groups is closer to the expectation. Group A 63%, Group B 46%, and Group C 22%. The advantages of Group A and B subject in the critical approach to terminological problems, shown in blue in the last column, is proved by the coincidence rates with unacceptable MT options, which amounts to 15% in Group A, 22% in Group B, and 49% in Group C. A considerable difference in the subject's independence in terminological problem solution, as well as its efficiency among the students of various groups, allow assuming that the said difference is caused by the dissimilarity in the intensity of the subject's thinking and analytical activity. The next slide, please. So our pilot study has generally confirmed the hypothesis that the regular post-editing of target text translated by means of the machine translation Google Translate system in combination with the think aloud procedure, think aloud protocol procedure modified for written translation promote the intensification of students' analytical and thinking activity and correspondingly the development of their critical approach to terminological problems, as well as the efficiency of specialized bilingual terminology acquisition and its use in the process of independence that is without machine translation. However, these assumptions, of course, require further research. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. So we can see that it was worth the waiting. I liked this presentation a lot because I myself teach specialized translation, and I found it very useful for research as well as for my own practice, and I hope that you did too. Since we are running a bit late, we will continue with the next presentation, which will be given by Magdalena Bila and Ingrida Vaňková from University of Prešov. So, dear ladies, the floor is yours.
Going to check presentation. We cannot see it.
At least we can see you. Let's wait a bit before we turn on the presentation. We can already see it in front of us.
Just wait a second, because okay. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, let me briefly introduce my colleague and myself. Both of us are affiliated to the University of Prešov, the Faculty of Arts, at which we are involved in teaching courses in translation studies and linguistics. Today we are going to present a research project on the necessity or inevitability of human intervention in raw CAT tool generated translation. We've got a problem to move our presentation, to control it. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so can we have the next slide, please? Two research studies have served as launching pads for the present research: a scholarly paper on tourist notices and a monograph co-authored by another colleague of ours on applying conceptualizing method in translation. The next slide, please. Let me start with some notes on how translation studies scholars view professional translators' work. Professional translators face considerable mental load since they want to live up to their clients' expectations. They need to browse a lot of information sources. They need to handle technological aids, write and edit the target text, and at the same time, they are torn between two competing concerns of loyalty to the source text and the editing the target text in order to meet the target audience's needs. Can I have the next slide, please? Translation process, whether it is translation from scratch or a CAT tool generated translation, consists of three phases: problem recognition, generation of alternatives, and final selection of options of translation solutions. Machine translation or CAT tool translation can considerably speed up the second phase. Now, a question may arise: how much do CAT tools actually diminish the mental load? Okay, thank you. Scholars ascribe the following drawbacks to CAT tools. First of all, they claim that they may prevent the translator from a holistic perception of the translated text. And secondly, language technology tools are unnecessarily restricting a translator's creative autonomy. In this respect, we may remind ourselves of a quote. Can I have the next slide, please? Stressing the quote, which stresses the importance of creativity in translation. Of course, there are certain text types which require a low level of creativity, for example, legal texts, and thus may be better suited for utilizing CAT tools.
Thank you so much. So we explored the interaction between a translator and CAT tool. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you so much. So we explored this interaction between translator and CAT tool on the case study of translation of tourist notices, particularly shortened popular versions of tourist notices. So we approached tourist notices from the perspective of translation and translator studies. In the present research, we draw on the concept of translanguaging, and we assume that a mere CAT tool generated translation, which isn't supplemented by human conscious act, is insufficient, and it may result in improper translation. This conscious, human conscious knowledge and experience-based act comprises lingua culturally underpinned activities of hermeneutic pre-understanding, conceptualizing, and configuring. Next slide, please. So, drawing on the concept of translanguaging, we argue in favor of hermeneutic conceptualization configuration method, which is an inevitable element in order to arrive at the proper target lingua culture oriented translation. The application of this method may unveil the necessity and inevitability of pragmatic adaptations made in the target text, and these are justified by the conceptualization of culture-bound differences. Next slide, please. Now, let me briefly comment on the hermeneutic conceptualization configuration method. This method is one of the main outputs of the ground research task on conceptual fluency and conceptualization in general, conceptualization intralingual and interlingual. It was its application on the level of lexeme and discourse was tested in the monograph published in 2018 and in several other publications. It consists of 4 stages. It's cognitive framing, hermeneutic pre-understanding, saliencing, and code configuring. We are going to deal with all these stages in few moments. The method can be of assistance in identifying the issues in raw machine translation output that need to be attended to and corrected, and in reducing the number of preferential changes. Next slide, please. So the aim of the present study is to find out whether this hermeneutic conceptualization configuration method may be deployed in post-editing of raw machine translated tourist notices. Here I would like to focus we would like to focus on shortened popular versions of tourist notices, which are derived from the national parks rules and regulations written in the form of decrees. Next slide, please. So drawing on the concept of translanguaging and applying the hermeneutic conceptualization configuration method, new challenge in linguistic landscape translation can be identified that is call for a new perspective which combines both conscious cognitive operations and axiological culture-specific evaluative operations, which can be explored through the concept of translanguaging. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Well, so as my colleague has already implied, our data consists of popular versions of tourist notices, not decrees from which they have been derived. The popular versions of tourist notices are the notices that are on display in 6 Slovak national parks out of 7. We have also included a tourist notice from 1 tourist spot and 2 tourist websites, which provide general rules for visitors to national parks. 2 analyses, the data, the extracted data, were then subjected to 2 analyses. The first one yielded the source text functions. It was based on the scheme as given by Rice. The second analysis was the hermeneutic conceptualization configuration method, and this eventually yielded the translation solutions in the post-edited version of the tourist notices. Can I have the next slide, please? The identified source text versions. This is the table that illustrates the text types, the language functions derived from text types, and the focus or the central focus of the individual text types. Can I have the next slide, please? The functions identified in the shortened versions of our of the tourist notices were as follows. The first one was appellative function that can be observed in texts that focus on the target audience or readership. The second function detected was informative function, normally found in informative texts. Some segments of the explored tourist notices provided basic information on the natural features of the individual national parks. The third function that was also detected was expressive function, which was manifested in emotionally loaded lexis. Can I have the next slide, please? The first stage of the second analysis was cognitive framing, which comprised 2 sub-analyses, geosemiotic and socio-pragmatic microanalyses, pertaining to the source text functions. Based on these microanalyses, Slovak national parks and tourist spots were defined as globally accessible places, which are typified by specific social practices. These are mainly related to a healthy lifestyle, an array of leisure time activities, hands-on learning, and also pertaining to identity or status formation and assertion. Can I have the next slide, please? The second stage of the second analysis, along with identification of special social practices, and in addition to signage itself, that is the text of the tourist notices, creates a specific type of public space which is typified by territorially limited linguistic landscape. Why is that so? This is because Slovak signage, that is the source text, is targeted at home audience, meaning it's territorially restricted. Slovak tourist texts may also be referred to as quasi-legal texts because they are derived from legal directives, and they are typified by the occurrence of legal terminology, legalese. This is an example. This slide provides an example of a tourist text that has been compiled by an authority. So it's a top-down text, and it typically comprises 3 segments: introduction, main body, and conclusion. Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please? The slide since the signage or the tourist texts are on display in a public space, they are typified by the operation of 4 principles. The 4 principles include good reasons, which a good reasons principle illustrated by politeness modality, collective identity principle, which may be illustrated by using the inclusive pronoun we, self-presentation principle, manifested by using scientific terminology, and power relations principle, which translates into formal language or legalese and typical modality. In the
We are having some technical issues right now. Stay with us.
a question whether this might be a kind of specific. Okay. Okay, so let me go back a bit. The Slovak signage, that is the Slovak notices, since they are on display in a public space, are based on the operation of 4 principles. These include good reasons principle, collective identity principle, self-presentation principle, and power relations principle. All of them are expressed through through using certain lexis or certain morphosyntactic structures and sticking to a specific type of modality. The Slovak signage manifests a certain hierarchy of these principles, in that the principles of collective identity and good reasons tend to be backgrounded, whereas self-presentation principle and power relations principle tend to be foregrounded. In such a manner, the signage creates a social situation in which the value of environment protection is to be achieved through civic obedience. Here we have posited a question. Is this a kind of specific and historically embedded lingua cultural feature? Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you.
So the second stage of hermeneutic pre-understanding is intended to arrive at the geosemiotic and socio-pragmatic anticipation of these future target text functions. This can be achieved through the analysis of the interaction between the following components. These are tourist spots as places which are related to specific social practice, and where notices or signage is placed. These components or elements together, they generate a specific type of globally accessible public space. One of its features is English signage, and as a target text of the translation process, it is globally accessible and intelligible and targeted at global audience. Next slide, please. So what should be the outcome of this phase, of the phase of hermeneutic pre-understanding? It is a notional delineation of meaning not yet verbalized. So in the case of the translation of popular versions of tourist notices, it should be the notion, the meaning of semantically intelligible, purposeful, and interculturally functional translation. Now, let me to compare it with the social situation in which environment protection is achieved by the civic obedience. In this case, taking into account diverse lingua cultures from which public audiences, tourists and visitors from diverse lingua cultures comes to Slovak national parks, and their specific axiological concept of spheres. So the translated notice is intended to create a social situation in which the value of environment protection is achieved through global community effort. And these two approaches are very different. Next slide, please.
Sorry for interrupting you, but can you please go a bit forward to the conclusion?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So, okay. So the question is how to conceptualize the meaning and how to reorder principles in order for the translation to be globally acceptable and linguistically achievable. Next slide, please. So, in the notices that are already targeted at global audience, the four principles are rearranged. The principles that are backgrounded are self-presentation and power relations, and foregrounded are good reasons and collective identity. Next slide, please. So, in the third stage, in the stage of saliencing, next important task has to be tackled with, and this task is to decide on how to arrive at the linguistic achievability of this aim. So the language of intercultural, of global communication or of global community is English as a lingua franca. It's a delocalized variety of English and is one of the features of so-called global village. In Europe, it is essential feature of its multilingual setting, which is often discussed under the term Eurospeak or Eurolect. And the two very basic features of this variety of English are its flexibility and purposefulness. Next slide, please.
Okay, I think we can generalize this kind of analysis to all the three structural elements: the introduction, the main body, and the conclusion of a notice. In the configuration, we again utilized the scheme given by Katarina Rice. That provides the text type or classification of text types, the language functions derived from text types, and also suggests the most appropriate method for each text type, which are the methods are as follows: plain prose, the so-called plain prose for informative texts, adaptation, in order to achieve equivalent effect for operative texts or with appellative function, and adopting source text author's perspective for expressive texts. Okay, so can we please move on to... okay, so these are examples for the individual part of or structural elements of the tourist notices. The first column illustrates the source text as given in Slovak. The second one is the raw MateCAD generated translation, and the third column illustrates the segments in after post or edited translation, that is after human translator intervention. Can we please move on?
Now let me give a few comments on source text and our role MT translation. So with regards to morphosyntax, we can observe numerous imperatives, passives, impersonal structure. The text contains primarily academic scientific terminology and professional jargon. Next slide, please. As a result, we can observe a high degree of formality, which is intended to cause social distance between the author and the target reader, and which further intensifies formality and impersonality. The outcome of the usage of these language means is a backgrounding of the principles of collective identity and good reasons, and enhancing or foregrounding the principles of self-presentation and power relations. Next slide, please.
Okay, I'm sorry, but we have run out of time, so we will have to wrap up this presentation and move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much. And I would like to tell you that if you click at the bottom of the screen, you can see the chat button. You can open it. It will open on the right-hand side of your Zoom screen, and there you can discuss what you are seeing. You can tell us your opinions on what you are hearing. You can ask questions. You can talk to each other if you want, okay? So at the bottom of the screen, you have to point at it with your mouse, and there you will see the chat button. So feel free to use it and talk to us. Okay, now let's move on to the next presentation. And that will be Markéta Števková and Ivo Poláček, both from the Comenius University in Bratislava. And please keep in mind that you have 15 minutes for your presentation, okay? Just a second while we switch. We are waiting for Ivo Poláček to connect. We are sorry for these delays, but it's very complicated to hold a conference in presence and online at the same time. So I hope that you understand this and you will be kind to us. Thank you.
Myslím, že začíná pani docentka Štefková.
Dear colleagues, my name is Markéta Štefková. I'm Associated Professor of Translation Studies at the Comenius University in Bratislava, and I will present together with my colleague specialized in machine translation and CAT tools at our faculty, the presentation about translating EncroChat, as you can see on the slide. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you our practical experience with a specific case of a translation assignment in criminal proceedings involving extensive drug activity. We both, I and Ivo, are working as sworn translators for the official authorities of the Slovak Republic. All through the legislation regulating the performance of legal translation for public authorities does not provide for such a method of performing the assignment. We formed a working group together with my colleague Polacek and a Spanish colleague, and due to the fact that the assignment had to be completed in a short time, we implemented CAT tools and machine translation tools. At the beginning of our presentation, we characterized the translation in criminal proceedings in the conditions of Slovak legislation. Then, using the case study of EncroChat translation, a colleague will explain the application of machine translation in this particular translation assignment. And finally, we will summarize the challenges facing the Ministry of Justice as a state body that manages the activities of official translators and the translators themselves in order to ensure a smooth flow of multilingual communication in criminal proceedings. And if it's possible, we are looking forward to a discussion and exchange with colleagues from Slovakia and abroad, maybe in the chat. Translation services, please the next slide. Translation services in criminal proceedings in the Slovak Republic provided by the translators registered on the list of the Ministry of Justice. These translators are registered after passing an exam organized by the Ministry, after meeting the administrative conditions prescribed by the acts that you can see now on the slide. The examination consists of a test on the content of the law regulating the activity of translators and written translation in a combination of Slovak and foreign language, and vice versa. The translation is done by hand on paper, and the translator may not use any electronic aids. Before the exam, the translator undergoes training, which consists of just 6 hours translation theory, the basics of criminal, civil, and administrative law, and the techniques of performing translation acts. The law does not require the applicants to have a degree in translation or interpreting in order to register. From this description of the current state of affairs, it is already clear that the examination and the prescribed training are not at all responsive to the needs of the modern investigative procedures and international criminal proceedings. State authorities commission translations by post in paper form. In many cases, they are not open to providing the translator with documents for translation in digitalized form. As the sociological research of György and Šveda from 2018 showed, a number of translators have only marginal or no experience in implementing CAD and machine translation in the translation process. They have no experience in working with corpus tools for researching equivalence of parallel texts. The outputs of Transuse project, please the next slide, from 2013 and 17 shows that translators prefer to translate in the legal sector word for word and understand fidelity to the original as a literal translation. They do not identify collocations in legal texts. In practice, quality control of legal translation is completely absent. The Ministry of Justice is responsible for supervising the work of official translators, but in practice, it does not actually carry out such supervision. Translators are not obliged to undergo lifelong learning. Next slide, please. If a criminal investigator needs to translate a multilingual document of larger scope, he does not have a state-appointed authority to manage such translation for him. He is proven to call on translators who are not trained to work as a team, share translation solutions, and apply modern technology. The investigator in our case study was in the same situation. As a part of an international investigation team, he needed to work with evidence in form of a large selection of communications from members of an organized crime group. Members of the group operated under nicknames. Please, the next slide. Please, the next slide. So the members of the group operated under nicknames and communicated in 3 languages using ciphers, slang terms, and collocational language in their communication. Nicknames appeared in the text in different linguistic mutations, while in the text of the translation, they were intended to identify specific persons. The text contained numerous typos and spelling errors. The frequent occurrence of vulgarism in several languages was also a hard nut to crack. There was insufficient context to interpret the meaning of some of the wording, which was partly revealed by the detained suspect's statements during the translation process. The text constituted crucial evidence and was subsequently used as a part of the indictment and the minutes of the interrogation and hearings. My colleague Ivo and I undertook this translation challenge without the legislative background of previous experience with such an assignment. We were often teetering on the edge of the rules for the performance of legal translation set by the law, which do not reflect the needs of the modern criminal proceedings. In the following explanation, my colleague Ivo specifies the tools and workflow we applied. Please, Ivo, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me. I will be very quick. So the task which lay ahead of us brought several practical problems, because what you can see now on your screen is the layout that we had to cope with. It was an Excel sheet from the electronic communication of the culprits, and it looked like an Excel sheet you can see on the screen. There was a nickname of the mafia guy who was writing to another mafia guy. There was a timestamp and the time zone, and then there was the body of the text, and all the text that was supposed to be translated was in one column of this Excel sheet. Now, in the CAD tools, you can usually define the areas that you want to translate in a given language. You can have multilingual Excels or multilingual Excel sheet, and you can define rows or columns that have different language and work and translate it as one project. However, this was a specific case because all the languages were in a single column, and we had to then take a different approach, therefore, and the investigator of this case also wanted at the end to create the same Excel which would have the translation and the original text in parallel. So what we had to do, we had to create not one multilingual project in MemoQ, and we used MemoQ because we at our faculty we have licenses available for this purpose, which we can distribute to the translators. So we created 3 different projects. Each project had its own language. Either it was English to Slovak or Spanish to Slovak and Dutch to Slovaks. And in order to simplify the work, we had to cycle the translation between the translators themselves. So that means one translator was working on one Excel sheet, and then when it was translated, it was passed to the other translator to translate the different part of the text. It had to be done in this way because at the end it would save us a tremendous amount of time, because as you may or may not be aware, it is not possible to merge columns in Excel in such a way that only some parts of the text would be maintained. So we saved in this way a great deal of manual work. As I have said, we have a school MemoQ license that was available to the translators, and we used it to first pre-translate all the files in our respective languages. With this, we also use the VPN connection in order to maintain the confidentiality and bring an extra element of security when we are connecting to the licensing server in our school. So in order to keep the translation memories clean, we wanted to maintain the Slovak English, Slovak Dutch, and Slovak Spanish translation memories clean. That means free from the other 2 languages that we used. So we had to lock the rows in Excels that were of different language in every single project. For that, already MemoQ has an algorithm, an artificial intelligence algorithm that enables you to automatically lock the rows in a different language. It is a tool that is not perfect. It has to be reviewed manually, as you can see in the picture that is in this slide above. There is the view of the translation being done from English to Slovak, and those rows which are not in English are locked, and these are then the segments which will be unlocked in the Slovak Spanish version. In order to speed up the work, we used the option to pre-translate it with machine translation. We used Google Cloud API and DeepL API for this purpose. Now, you may say that this is a sensitive document. It is a part of the investigation document, and we all know that Google Translate has somewhat loose privacy agreement that you consent to when you are using the service. However, these 2 consoles, or the API solution that uses a similar engine to Google Translate, and the DeepL console have a different privacy settings. They basically anonymize the data which cannot be then reconstructed by a third person. So if you are using this plugin in MemoQ or SDL or any other CAT tool, you are quite okay to use it and be still more or less secure with your data. Just one word about the DeepL and the automatic translation from English to Slovak. If you go to the website of DeepL, you can see that the cat tool plugin from English to Slovak is not available. However, we tested it and somehow it worked. So in some form it is available and the plugin is already working. So we locked all the segments of the different languages and it was automatized. Our Spanish colleague was not so tech savvy as we two were, and he was not using cat tools. He only used the Excel pre-translated Excel sheet to post edit the translation. So what we did in retrospect was, in order to perfect his translation memory that was used by us in his Spanish-Slovak part of the project, was that we then created parallel text with his post-edited translation, and we have rewritten the translation memories that originally contained only machine translation work. In MemoQ, the parallel text and parallel corpora look like this. The situation was quite facilitated by the fact that we have been using Excel, so no additional editing of the translation memory was used. So there was an easy structure which brought quick results. And as conclusions from my part, what we did was some statistical data, and there was in total 1,200 normated pages in 3 different languages, which were distributed in various amounts, of course, between these 3 languages. And because we had these translations available in 3 different projects, we could also calculate the ranges and the final amount of pages at the very end. It was quite easy, and it took us 3 months with 3 translators and 3 languages, which is quite a feat if you consider all the street talk and all the irregularities in the language the mafia guys were using. So I think that's all from me. Yes, that would be all from me. So the floor goes back to my colleague Marketa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivo. And I just say by conclusion that we would like to summarize our experience as a challenge that requires a considerable amount of creativity and flexibility in addition to the traditional competencies for a translator given, among others, by, for example, the EMT. This experience has taught us that it is essential to be lifelong learners and to develop our skills in working with new technologies, without which such a task would not be possible. On the following slide, we have summarized a suggestion of several lines of action that could be taken to enable criminal translators or translators in criminal proceedings to respond flexibly to the needs of investigators and prosecutors. Please, the next slide. Should I click it? Okay, Ivo, please. So just when you look on the slide, you see 3 groups of steps that we suggest to be taken to professionalize the whole process. It is the level of the institutionalization at the side of the Ministry of Justice, and then what should the translators do, and the technical part. Thank you for your attention, and on the last slide we have some open questions that we would like to raise with you in discussion, if it's possible, maybe via the chat. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one question. We are running late. We need to start the roundtable discussion, but we will, because this is very interesting. I want to know myself. Mr. Pedersen is asking, is this focus on having everything on paper only caused by security concerns, or is there any other reason why we need to work with paper?
Actually, it is already prescribed by law that the prosecutors have to form a digital research material, but still a lot of evidence you have just on paper. For some reason, the prosecutors, especially the prosecutors, don't want to send us the digital form. We just have to scan it when we want to use CAT tools. It's something that is waiting for for the next generation prosecutors, maybe who understand that using CAT tools it's much cheaper, much quicker for them, not just for us.
Okay, so it's basically a matter of the approach, right? Okay, I hope that will change in the near future. Okay, thank you very much. And now we will continue to the roundtable discussion. Thank you.